Good afternoon and welcome to Alfred Music's webinar series, Learn, Teach, Play Online. My name is Michaela Graham, Senior Event Specialist for Alfred Music, and I'll be running everything in the background for our session today. We are thrilled to host today's webinar, Teach Your Students to Compose Themselves. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes for you. At the end of the webinar, we will provide a link to the certificate of attendance for today's session. Please note the certificate of attendance will only be available for live attendees and not for the replay. If you have any questions or comments for our presenter throughout the session, please feel free to drop it in the chat box. We love hearing your thoughts throughout the presentation, and we will have a specific time for Q&A at the end of today's session. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter today. Robert Sheldon is one of the most performed composers of wind band music today. He is also the lead author of Sound Innovations for Concert Band, a recipient of numerous awards from the American School Band Directors Association, Phi Beta Mu, and the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. His compositions embody a level of expression that resonates with ensembles and audiences alike. His music is performed around the world and appears on many international concert and contest lists. Robert Sheldon received an honorary doctorate from Vandercook College of Music in July of 2020. We're so glad you're able to be with us today, Robert. I'm going to hand the presentation off to you, so let's get started.
Very good. Thank you so much, Michaela. Can you hear me okay?
You sound wonderful.
Very good. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak with you today about one of my great passions, which is writing music. But first, I'd like to provide you with some instruction about how to access the handout for today's session and the materials that are available. So first, you're going to go to robertsheldonmusic.com, scroll down to Clinic Topics and Handouts, select the Access Handouts button, scroll down to the title of the session, and open the link. Let me share my screen, and we can do it together. Let's see if I can do this here. All right. Goodness. Hang on just a second. It went away on me here, so I need to pull that back up. Here we go. All right. So here's the robertsheldonmusic.com. And as you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see Clinic Topics and Handouts, and just click on the button. And then you can scroll down to the title of today's session, which is this one here, Teach Your Students to Compose Themselves. And I'll click on that. And there you go. And I'll make this a little bit larger as we get into that. Okay, and we'll be, you can download this and print it. You can look at it while we're talking, or whatever really works for you. So I'm going to go back over here, turn the screen share off, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion about this and come back to that handout in just a bit. You know, I have always enjoyed composing music, really from a pretty young age. At the age of 12, I started writing pieces for piano, and then later progressed to small ensembles and then jazz band. And then my first all-state experience, which was for all-state band, it really inspired me to write my first band piece, and I've been writing ever since. I've always written arrangements for my students over my 28 years of teaching, and my bands and orchestras also played some of my published as well as some of my manuscript pieces. Part of my yearly rehearsal schedule was to teach basic arranging skills, and many of my high school students went on to write some excellent pieces. I later taught composition at Florida State University and Bradley University, but my position as editor for 17 years at Alfred Music required me to provide a lot of input for composers, and that really kind of fine-tuned my ideas about what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I had always thought of conducting and performing as being a creative endeavor, but I still remember the moment when I was getting my master's degree in conducting, and I kind of had an epiphany during one of my lessons that the conducting and the performing is largely a recreative endeavor, not creative. So it's the creation of music is something that many musicians can do, but are often afraid of trying or really don't know how to get started. So here are some ways to help your students get involved in the process of composition. So first of all, where to begin? What does the composer want to say? If you don't have anything to say, why are you trying to write it down? It's the same thing as if you're writing a story or an article for a newspaper or a magazine. You don't just write words and hope it's going to come out right. You really have to have an idea about what you're writing. Then you need to decide what sounds you want to use that can best accomplish the portrayal of your message. And knowing the answer to this question is going to save the composer a lot of time, because you need to know what type of ensemble you want to use, what style or genre is most appropriate for your message. Now, group lessons is something that can be a very effective method of getting students started in compositions, but once the students get to a certain point, you're probably going to need to be thinking about it more in terms of individual lessons, because at a certain point in time, every note, everything on the page really needs to be analyzed pretty thoroughly. But first, I want to talk to you about group lessons, because it can be an effective way of at least sparking an interest in your students writing a piece of music. So first of all, the planning comes into play. You need to decide what the overall picture of the piece is going to be, and as I mentioned, what you want to say. Then the next thing is to develop the message and the mood and the form of the piece. And what type of piece and what kind of ensemble can best communicate your message. Now, in terms of group lessons, at least at the beginning, I have found that aleatoric music and using non-traditional instruments can be a very effective way of getting your students interested in composing, because it gets your students thinking in terms of sounds and form and expression without having to worry about notation or transposition. So one way I have done this, and you're certainly welcome to use this if you'd like, is I have often used the concept of writing a piece as a group about a topic such as a tropical rainstorm. So, and this is something that's very easy to be able to do. So generally I would display on the whiteboard, the chalkboard, whatever it was, I would display what the form of the piece was going to be. And we could even create this as a group. So let's say, for instance, you want to start out with the setting, maybe a dense tropical rainforest, and therefore you're going to need some wind sounds from the group. Maybe some bird and animal sounds can be kind of fun. So you have them do that. You have the students create that backdrop for the piece. And then maybe raindrops begin. And of course, if you're going to borrow ideas from a composer, you should take from the best. So think Eric Whitacre here, and obviously the raindrops with the finger snaps that he uses. And then you go to a heavier rain, which is where they start to slap their legs. And you kind of can scan the group and say, you're not going to start your finger snapping until we point to you. And then now we're going to start so the storm becomes much, much heavier. And then maybe you want to get to some thunder sounds. This is where the students can get very creative. How are you going to create the sound of thunder? And it depends on with the room that you're in and what you have around you. I've seen students drop a stack of books on the floor, or if you had some horrible little metal chairs, that slap those, or whatever it would be. But the kids can get creative with whatever that is to create the thunder sounds. And then as the rain passes, we go back to the finger snaps, and then the storm ends and you're back to silence. So once you've created this and you've discussed it, and you have it listed in front of the students, then you can at once premiere the piece and perform it all at the same time based on what you've come up with here. So what it really does is it just gets the kids thinking about its sounds, its forms, it's the mood, it's the picture, and they're not even thinking about specific notes or key signatures or transpositions or rhythms or anything. All it is to get the creative juices flowing. Now, once the students have started into the idea of being able to think about composition, obviously, if you are in a wind band setting, you have a greater difficulty level of complexity because of all of the transpositions of the different instruments. I mean, obviously with choir, you have some bass clef, treble clef. With strings, you have the added challenge of alto clef with the violas. But with band, you have an awful lot of instruments and a lot of different keys you have to deal with. And so we need to be thinking about transposition. And I'm going to show you, and you can view it yourself if you already have the handout in front of you. I'm going to talk to you about the transposition chart that I've included for you that you can download and print to be able to use if it's of help to you. And I'll show you how it works and why I have done it the way I did. So the next part of this is to actually start thinking about notes. And I have found one of the best ways to do this is to think about orchestrating a chorale. And you could do this with Bach chorales. Again, why not use the very best you got? But I would find a book of chorales, or a hymnal is another great place to be able to find these. And let the students choose what they would like to arrange. And they don't have to arrange the entire thing. I found that 8 measures is a good way to start. And everybody gets a different hymn, a different chorale. And there's a lot of ways that you can teach the students to be able to arrange or orchestrate this. First of all, they need to understand the concept of the voicings, the SATB voicings, and how that relates to instruments, which instruments would be appropriate. So, for instance, you might want to do it in terms of maybe starting out as their section. So if it's SATB by section, it might be flute on the S, flute on the A, oboe on the tenor, bassoon on the bass clef. You might on the bass part. Or in clarinets, it might be 1, 2, 3 bass clarinet. Or saxophones, easy, alto, alto, tenor, bari. You get the idea. So you can divide it up by sections or smaller ensembles. Then the next thing to do is to think about it in terms of maybe the full ensemble. Have them try it again. Which instruments would be the most appropriate sopranos or altos or tenor or bass instruments? And they can do it that way. See why in 8 measures is probably about all you want to do. Otherwise, it gets into a lot of writing. By the way, I strongly suggest not having the students use a notation program like Finale or Sibelius or Dorico. Doing it by hand at this stage is really important for several reasons. First of all, by doing it by hand, it may be the first time, at least in a long time, the students have done any kind of notation by hand. And it's important that they know how to do that. The second thing is, when they do it by hand, every mark they make, especially when they extract parts, takes a long time to do. Therefore, when they see that articulation or that key signature or whatever it is in other music that they're performing, they have more of a tendency to really pay attention to it because they know how long it took them to do it themselves. So once they've had a chance to do a sectionalized version of and then maybe a full band version with different instruments on different parts, then the third way to do it is to divide it up within the ensemble. So it may be first and second or first, second, third parts in different instruments, depending on the age level that of the ensemble that the students are playing in. If it's middle school, maybe just 2 parts, high school probably 3, to be able to divide it up that way. And they need to be able to listen to the difference in this, because the colors, the subtle differences in the colors are going to also be a great inspiration to them. So I say all pencil and paper, score and parts, and not notation system at this point, because it has a great value to them. Now, the next part comes with individual lessons. My first composition teacher was one of my heroes, Clifton Williams. And Dr. Williams had his students do these exercises. There were 2 of them. One he called his 5-finger melodies. And what this was to go to a piano, and the first step would be to come up with 10 descriptors. And you could start out kind of easy, just like, happy, sad, joyous, depressed, whatever it may be, but come up with 10 descriptors. And then for each descriptor, just write he called them a 5-finger melody, but just basically a 5-note melody that describes your mood that you've just written down. And so you're going to wind up with 10 descriptors and 10 five-finger melodies that match those. Now, the challenge here is to be able to go to someone, hopefully a friend of yours who's not going to be too critical, and say, here's a list of descriptors. I'm going to play one of my five-finger melodies, and I want you to choose the descriptor that you think matches it. And that's your assessment to determine how successful you were. Now, of course, you want to avoid the histrionics of performing it so that it looks like that. I mean, you want to be a blank slate and let the music speak for itself to be successful with this. The second thing you can do is to do what he called 5-note clusters times 3. So you would take both hands, you would come up with, you would write clusters of notes. They wouldn't probably be major, minor, whatever. They are tone clusters, and do 3 of them. And those 3 clusters should represent one of your descriptors. So you want to have your list of moods, you know, resolute, apprehensive, bored, angry, whatever it may be, and then create the melodies, and then separately create the clusters to represent those moods. And then, of course, whoever you choose to be your victim can match the melody and the cluster to the mood. But it's a really fun exercise for your students to try, because here again, they're not worried about notation, they're not worried about form, or they're not worried about rhythms, they're not worried about transpositions. What they're thinking about is the sound and how it affects people. And I think that's an important way to start. Now, how to begin less experienced students with little or no theory background. Now, some of these teaching methods that we're talking about, I've actually included in the handout, and they're taken from some of the materials I wrote for the Sound Innovations book 1 for concert band. And I'm going to talk to you about them a bit, and then I'll show them to you. So one of the first things you can do is to write some music and then just omit some notes and let the students see where the omitted notes are, and they can choose how to fill that blank space. So they're not having to come up with a whole melody on their own or a whole tune. They're just little bite-sized pieces. What's the appropriate note to fill in here? And in most cases, as you go through and have students fill in a missing note, most of them are going to pick some pretty predictable notes. You just know that they will. However, there's always going to be that one student that is completely outside of the realm of logic. They may be your most creative student, so don't discount that. You just want to be able to be open to a variety of ideas on this. But have the students decide which notes to use to fill in the missing note. And you could do this also with a missing measure. So let's say it's a 4-measure tune. You leave out 1 measure and see if the students, or an 8-measure tune, see if the students can figure out how to fill that measure logically and musically. Repeating interesting rhythms or melodic fragments can help create interest and strength in a composition. Again, I'm going to show you all these in a moment. Improvising melodies, trading measures with another student, or between the teacher and student, is another great way to start having the students come up with melodic ideas. Using the idea of an antecedent and consequent phrase to promote a musical conversation. Say, you know, antecedent phrase is the question and the consequent phrase is the answer. So I've written you a musical question, you write me the musical answer that is appropriate. Writing a short melody and then creating a bass line to go with it, and then coming up with a counter melody or an accompaniment to go with it. Suddenly your piece is starting to come together. And you can experiment with changing textures and thematic variations of your melody as well. And then the other thing is you want to think about form. So after you create an A theme and it's complete, you can write a contrasting B theme and create a piece in the ABA form, or you can write a variation of the A form and you have like an A prime, B, A piece. So let's take a look at some handouts here, and I'll see if we can, if I can show you how all of that works. So here we go. I'll share my screen with you. Let's see, here we go. So we're going to scroll down here and I'll show you. So these are some ideas. So for instance, beginning a composition process of making decisions about right notes. So you can see where the arrows are here, and in each place.
Hey, Robert,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you shared the wrong tab because we don't see the PDF. I'm still just seeing your website.
Okay, let me see if I can get to that. Stop sharing that tab and share this tab. Thank you, Michaela.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thanks for keeping me on task there. I appreciate it. Okay, so here's a way that you complete the melody where the arrows are. And here again, if you look at this, you see this da da dee da dum space bum, and you know the majority of the students are going to go da 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 dum, and you'll still have that one student that comes up with a note that's 7 octaves lower or 3 octaves higher, that's a tritone away. Again, might be the most creative kid in the room, but it may not be logical. So you want to explain to the students in this particular exercise, you want to be logical and not weird. And then you can see how the rest of this goes. It's da da dum, and most people would go da dee da dum. I've done this in a room full of teachers, and without talking about it, 98 3/4%, which is a number I just made up, of the teachers will sing the notes just as you can imagine they might. There are creative teachers as well, of course. I'm using creative in quotes. So here we go. Here's another one, number 2. We want to complete the melody by adding your own notes. So we won't go through this too carefully, but you get the idea. You see where the arrows are. Here's now here we have an entire measure that we're going to recreate. Complete the melody by adding your own notes in the indicated measure. Now, one of the things that's important about ending this particular piece, you can see there's a double bar at the end of it here, is you probably, to make it the most strong melody you can make, you want to end on the tonic note. So there's a variety of ways you can talk to the students about what the most appropriate way is to end this piece, how to write that measure. But that's the students that end on the tonic are going to obviously have the strongest sounding composition there. Now, at the intermediate level, we're back to the note selection exercises. And in this case, we have one here that's in the treble hand and one that's in the bass. And you can decide how you want to do that. But if you can play piano and leave a note, the students can kind of decide what the best way is to do this. This is not beginner level. This is now intermediate, because now you're having to think not only about what note might work in the melody, but also how it works in terms of the bass line, which means now you're thinking about chord progressions and counterpoint. So it's definitely another level of complexity. And some students will just grab onto this immediately. Others, it may take a while. And then here's another one. Add your own notes in the indicated places to complete the melody and counter melody. Now, please understand, these are just examples. I would not expect you to go through these 5 in that order. I'm just giving you examples so that you can write your own. Don't just hand this out and say, well, we've already done 1 through 4. You should be able to be number 5 now. That's not the way it works. I'm just giving you examples so that you can write your own. The students will require far more repetition and more examples of this before they feel comfortable getting to something what we've got here with this number 5. But again, I'm just giving you some samples. So, all right, now we're going to talk about writing melody and bass lines. And these are some things we just discussed, so I want to show you examples of it in real time. Writing a strong melody, as it says here, often involves outlining a chordal structure and repeating interesting melodic or rhythmic ideas and ending on the tonic note. So if you look at this, we have repetition of the interval in measure 1 to measure 2. Measure 3 is not an exact repetition, but it's an indication of the interval, but the rhythm is the same. And then you have a repeated note to the dotted half, which strengthens that. You started on the C, you're going to the C here, it's an octave higher, but because of the note prior to it, it now strengthens that. Now in the next 4 measures, you have this series of notes that you can see there's a bit of a sequence going on, and we're strengthening the sequence through rhythmic and intervallic development, but we're ending on the tonic for a more cohesive sound. And here you can play this on your piano at home. You can print these out and see what you think. Now, when writing a good bass line, you'll find it often involves selecting the notes that really enhance the melody while satisfying the harmonic structure in an interesting way. So you can see where these bass notes are. They, even though the melody starts on C, starts on the fifth, you want to have the tonic F there. And that way, these first two notes, the C to the A in the melody, along with the F in the bass, has outlined your chord. Now, the placement of the bass note C on beat 3 allows you to not only define the chord, but also provides an expectation of the beat. If you don't have anything there, the 8th note in the melody becomes a little more abstract. So having beat 3 in your bass line provides a jumping off point for that 8th note at the end of the measure. Same thing in the next measure. And here again, you're kind of outlining the chord in measure 2 with your bass notes. And now in measure 3, you'll see a bit of counter melody here with that B flat. You're kind of creating a melodic line from the C to the B flat to the A. And then while the melody has that dotted half note, here again, because you have an expectation of the beat, you have something going on beats 2 and 3. And going to the second line, we've got imitation in the bass line of the treble line. Again, it helps to strengthen. If you look at here the first measure of the second system, and then look at measure 2 in the bass line, it kind of outlines that. So you've got a bit of a canonic development. You also have repetition, you've got imitation, you're strengthening this, you're outlining the chord. You're doing a whole lot of things with this. And then, of course, ending on the tonic for satisfaction. And by dropping that last measure down an octave, it all becomes more interesting, and everybody's on the F. It's just kind of a nice, satisfying way to end this. So here again, you're welcome to try playing that at home if you'd like. And now we're going to use this melody that we've created and this bass line that we've created, and now we're going to enhance it. We're going to add some accompanying parts. And what I'm doing here, this can be played on piano, but in effect, it's really, as an ensemble, sort of a condensed score that I'm writing. So you can see here we're providing some rhythmic interest with these 8th notes, and then a repetition of that in the next measure. Again, repetition provides strength, it provides cohesion. Repetition again in the next measure, and now we have in the in this where this arrow is, we've got some harmony, we've got some contrapuntal action, which actually mimics the contrapuntal voice here in the bass line in measure 3. Now we're kind of doing the same in the 4th measure. So it's canonic as well as repetitive and contrapuntal. Now we go on to the second system. And what I've really done here is I'm just completing the chords that enhance the melody, but I got to get out of the way of the melody too. So this takes you back to your basic voice leading that we all had when we were freshmen in college, right? Kind of very much the same thing, completing the chords, but get out of the way of the melody. Now here in this next measure, you can see we've recalled an earlier rhythm. And that's another way to strengthen the piece, to recall the elements of the piece that were interesting in some way or important, because again, it helps to strengthen it and provide cohesion. Here again, we're just completing the chords, getting out of the way of the melody, and then we have a nice ending to it. So again, we're just building all the things we've started. Again, this is not something you can do in one day. I'm just showing you how you actually get to where you're headed. This is because this right here, we're going to put it all together. Now we're adding articulation, we're adding dynamics, tempo, style indications to complete the piece. You know, it's interesting. I have found so often in young composers, and by young, what I'm talking about here is even college age. Maybe I should say younger than me, which is most everybody I know these days. But in young composers, they will write a piece of music and it will be lacking things like a tempo or a style. And you would think that would be one of the first things you would want to include. But I find most often younger students have a tendency to go for rhythm without articulation and melody without any kind of style or tempo. So this is the way we make sure we complete the piece. And now you can see it's basically what we've already done, but now we've added in these extra elements, and you actually now have a piece of music. I'm going to show you a few of the items we have in Sound Innovations that can help. These are all out of the SI Online elements of the enrichment activities that are available in Book 1 of Sound Innovations. So, for instance, we have, and this first one here is actually in the book. It's in the printed version, where we have this hot cross buns, and we're asking the students to write their own variation by changing the rhythm or notes in some way and then playing it. And the variation, which we call cinnamon buns, can be anything. It could be as easy as making every note, like every quarter note, making them 2 eighth notes on a repeated note. So instead of 3, 2, 1, it could be 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, or however you want to do it. Just some variation of it. Students that are more advanced can, you could turn it into a minor key, whatever you want to do. And then here's another one directly out of Book 1, the printed book. We have the first 4 measures, and then we've asked the students to write the last 4 measures. And here again, you've got all the information right in the clef, the meter, the key signature, tempo, style that you choose. Place the notes and rhythms you already know on the staff in any order. You add the dynamics, put your name on it, play it for your friends and family. And now we get into more of the more complex part of it, and these are out of the enrichment pages in SI Online. So on each chapter, there's 6 chapters, has a composition unit, and you can see here just exactly what I showed you earlier. We've left out some notes, and you can tell where they are. 4 times, there's a note left out here. Okay, here's another one with a note left out. Here's obviously a note left out. This one, every measure has at least 1 note left out, so the students can fill it in however they like. Let's go on to Unit 2. Here's a composition unit where we have a 4-measure melody, and then the students get to write the next 4 measures. Here's another one. We've got an 8-measure melody where the students complete 2 measures in the antecedent phrase and 2 measures in the consequent phrase. Here's another one where we have an 8-measure melody, and now the students listen to the antecedent phrase and they complete the 4-measure consequent phrase. Down here's one. This is exactly what we talked about with the 5-finger melodies. And we want the students to be able to do this, to create these melodies in different moods: excited, sad, angry, content, and it's the same exercise we just talked about. And here in level 6, now we've actually done this, teaching the students about tone rows and writing them forward and backward. This may seem like a very esoteric way of teaching composition, but it really is a good technique to use even when they're using standard notation and traditional music. It doesn't have to be aleatoric or serial music. You can use retrograde to be able to bring cohesion to a piece of any style. So just to throw that out there. Now, this is the transposition chart that I was telling you about. And let me explain how this works. So I've got basically a full score here: piccolo, flute, oboe, each of the instruments, just 1 staff for each of the instruments. I don't have percussion on here yet. We'll get to that in a minute. But you can see the first measure has 4 notes. The 2 notes in the middle are larger. And what I recommend for students is when they're writing a piece for band instruments to stay within the range of these notes. Stay within that range. Now, the notes on the outside, the small notes, are possible, but not everybody can play them. And here again, if you're in a middle school situation, even these situations, the outside notes are there as a more extreme thing. So for instance, if the students are writing something and they just need an extra note above or below, I want them to know the note is there. Yes, if you want to, you can use it, but the recommendation is to stay within the range that is listed there. And you can see what all of them are. Now, I've got a blank measure here because over here in these 4 measures, what I've done is to write a concert B flat scale. But this B flat scale is in unison. It is not in octaves. And let me explain. I want the students to be able to visualize how the notes are in unison throughout the full ensemble. So for instance, if you look at the clarinet, that is the entire scale that I've written here. It's not, obviously it is not a complete scale, it just goes up to this note. But I've done this for a reason, because if you look up here, notice the piccolo only has 3 notes. It's because they can't play any of these other notes. It's too low. That's important for the students to understand. Okay, here the flute can't play that first note. They start on the C. The bassoon's going to run out of range, as is the bari sax and the tenor sax. And, you know, by the time you get down here to the tuba, they only have 1 note. And actually, that's not really even a very good note for most tuba players. It's too high. But the point is, I want the students to be able to visualize what unison is like for all of those instruments. It's important for them to be able to see it. So this has worked very well for me, and you're welcome to use it if it will help you. And now I told you we'd save percussion for a bit. So here's a percussion map and a notation guide, which is something I think is useful. Now, the thing about percussion notation is every publisher does this differently, and that's not helpful because, well, maybe it is. Percussionists learn that they look almost anywhere for their notes. I mean, they could be anywhere on the page. They can be on any kind of staff. It could be any kind of note head. They get to be very flexible. But generally, notation for percussion dictates that we use what is pretty much used for a drum set, a trap set player. So on a 5-line staff, and of course here again, some percussion is written on a 1-line or a 2-line or a 3-line, but if we're going to use 5-line for now, on a 5-line staff, snare drum always appears on the 3rd space and bass drum on the bottom space. Suspended cymbal generally goes above the staff, and metallic instruments like cymbals are usually notated with a diamond or X head. Diamond for the open notes like whole notes and half notes, dotted half notes. X's for the closed notes such as quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes. Crash cymbals generally are notated below the staff. And having said that, snare drum stems go up, bass drum stems go down, suspended cymbal stems go up, crash cymbal stems go down. So they're always the stem is always pointing away from the middle of the staff. Tambourine and triangle can go wherever you'd like them. They can live any place as long as they do not live in the same place as one of these 4 other instruments. They can be wherever you'd like. And that goes for all of the other instruments that you might include on your piece. Triangle note heads generally are notated with a triangle-shaped note head, but it doesn't have to be. Tambourine is usually done with a standard note head, but I've seen it done with X and diamond heads as well. Now, mark tree, and this is something sometimes notated as wind chimes. Wind chimes actually are not the same as a mark tree. Wind chimes have no pitch directive, so they're things that hang from the corner of your house outside, and they make just random sounds. That's different than a mark tree, which was created by Mark Stevens, and a mark tree actually does have pitch, which means you need to notate it in some way. And again, different publishers do this in a variety of ways. I've seen all kinds of things. But this is the way I have notated it when I started at Alfred. This is the way I've started doing it, and it's worked well because it provides not only the direction, but the duration and the ending point for the strumming of the instrument. And then, of course, these let ring ties are also important. Notes that have a let ring tie explain the instrument is going to ring. And let ring ties, you probably want to consider them for notes such as cymbals, triangle, bass drum, timpani, bells, chimes, vibraphone, because all those notes will ring unless you dampen them. And without the little let ring tie, that indicates that it should dampen on the release. Next thing we should talk about are rolls. 3 slashes generally for a roll. But if it's on an eighth note, the eighth note actually already has a flag going for it. So you usually just add 2 slashes for eighths and 1 for sixteenths. I don't know how often you see a 16th note roll, but there you go. And rolls should tie to a release somewhere. Otherwise, the player doesn't really know how long to roll it. I mean, do you release, where? Where is it? Sometimes it can't be notated for just strange reasons that happens, but generally tied to a release note. And then slurs are usually used for flans and roughs. That's included like you would with any grace note. That's just a standard thing. Is you would use slurs for roughs or flans. Now tom-toms, you try to separate the notes a little bit because they're easier to read. So maybe put them on the spaces or on the lines. Same thing with tempo blocks. There's usually 5 of them. So putting them on the lines, it's easier to read them when they're separated. And then other instruments, you place them wherever you want, wherever something else is not being used. Now, if you wind up with enough instruments that you just you're using up every line in space, I think you might have too much percussion. I mean, just my thought on that. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that tab at this point, and we're going to go back to here. Michaela, am I back on?
You're good on time. Is that what you're asking?
Time, and I've stopped sharing, correct?
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Very good. All right, so let's go ahead and continue now. The next thing is about your piece. We've talked about something you need to keep relevant. Make sure the students are writing a piece so that it can be played immediately, either by a piano or a small ensemble. Remember, the smaller the number of players, it needs to be able to be played with very little or no rehearsal required. So sometimes it's a good idea just to get the first part of the piece done and be sure you're on the right track before you write an entire piece of music and find out you just don't like what you started with. That's a waste of time. So just maybe write the first part, listen to it, make some corrections. So having a plan will help keep them focused so they don't waste time or paint themselves into a musical corner that's really difficult to get out of. So what I do is I plan the piece almost as if I was taking a vacation. I was taking a trip. Where am I going? How long am I going to be gone on this trip? Who's going with me? What do I plan to see? Am I returning home or am I going to stay there? Is it a one-way trip? So by doing that, it forces you to decide, the meaning behind the piece, which is where you're going. Why are you going there? That's the meaning. So once you have that, then the instrumentation, which is who's going on this trip with you, right? And the next thing is the form, which is what do you intend to do on this trip? What are the little side trips you're going to take? Where are the places you're going to see? What do you plan to do? And then are you coming home? Because if you're coming home, you need to plan time in the piece to musically come back. If you're staying there, you don't need to worry about that. And then the next part is the duration, which is really how long is your trip going to be? Are you taking a month-long vacation or is it a weekend getaway? So knowing the duration is an important thing too, okay? Sharing, you want to make sure that the piece is playable with regards to key, rhythm, range, and technique, because students often seem to write music that's incredibly not playable. They write stuff that's amazingly difficult to play, but have them focus on sound and expression rather than difficulty. I've often said music doesn't need to be a blizzard of notes to be musical. Have them focus on sound and expression. And we talked about using pencil and paper rather than a computer. The other reason for using pencil and paper is it cuts down on cut and paste, because students can write for 3 minutes and then cut and paste their way into a 100 measure long piece just like that. Doesn't mean the piece is good. It just means they've cut and pasted a lot. The other thing about computers is students have a tendency to get caught up in what they've already written, and they just listen to it over and over again. So there's good reason to use computers, but I'm just saying writing by pencil and paper can also be helpful too. And also computer notation, they can write things that are virtually unplayable. So anyway, and also cut and paste can make things unreasonably long and repetitive. Now, you want to help your young composer with craftsmanship. You would think that people that write music because they're feeling something really profound would be thinking about things like expressive markings. But as I mentioned before, that's something that a lot of younger composers in particular omit. So be thinking about that. Is the tempo indicated? Is there a style or an expression marking? I personally like to use standard metronome markings because they look and feel right to me. In other words, quarter note equals 100 or 104, 108 or 112, not 110. It's not a marking. I mean, nobody's going to hit it exactly, but for me, if it was good enough for Bach, I just use the standard markings. Dynamics, articulation markings, are they clear and consistent? Use a destination dynamic. How loud do you want it to get? Make sure you have that listed. Remembering that color is created by using interesting instrument combinations, but also rests, which provide a good opportunity for instrument combinations and color. And do you have enough rests in there to avoid fatigue? Are the percussion requirements reasonable? I mean, I've seen a lot of pieces that you only need 5 players, but on one beat, you need 14 hands to be able to do it. Passing tones, are they interfering with the harmony? Listen for technical issues. Are these things can be easily resolved by rewriting them just a little bit? Is the key signature correct? A lot of times kids will start out with one key, they gravitate towards another, and then the key has anything to do with the piece. So look for that. Rehearsal numbers, putting them at the appropriate places, like at the beginning of phrases, usually every 8 to 12 measures. Cause and effect is a great way to ensure logic in a musical conversation of the piece and promotes cohesion. Examining published scores is a really good thing to do. Remember that students back in the day, where they were taking lessons from Vivaldi or from Mozart, the way they learned was they were given a full score and told to extract all of the parts. And without copy machines, it meant they had to do how many violin parts, how many whatever. That may seem like a thankless task, but actually doing that really helps you get into the head of the composer to understand every little thing about it. And then, of course, the final product. Deadlines are important. Students have to complete something. Pieces are lots easier to start than they are to finish. And have it be something that can be played in class. It's really great to be able to share it and have the students get feedback in real time. And if you can, perform the piece on a concert or recital. It doesn't have to be, the quality of Bach or Beethoven. Having the student have an opportunity to have their piece performed publicly is a life-altering thing for them. So I think maybe now, Michaela, might be a good time for some questions and answers. Well,
yes.
I don't know if I have the answers, but at least see what the questions are.
Perfect. Well, before we get to the questions, this will give everyone an opportunity to put any questions that they might have into the chat box for us. But before we get to that, I have a couple of links for you guys just to make sure that y'all have the opportunity to grab them. The certificate of attendance, I just put a link to that into the chat. And also our post-event survey. If you guys could go in there and give us your thoughts for today's webinar, any recommendations for webinars that you want to see from us in the future, any questions that you have for Alfred Music specifically, or Robert separately from this webinar, we can always pass those questions on to him directly as well. It would be super helpful if you could fill that out. And now let's see, I think I only have one question in here so far. So Heather says, as many of us are teaching online these days, do you have any tips on adapting these lessons for online instruction?
Well, actually, everything we've talked about would really work as a virtual instruction, either individually or as a class. It's harder to do the classroom composition. Maybe that's something you aren't going to do. Although in a group Zoom, you could even really pretty much do it that way for the purposes of what that's supposed to do. But otherwise, if the students are writing something, they can always write a solo just for the instrument that they play and then share that over a Zoom call. And even have each student say, can you play the first 4 measures of your piece? And as long as you have the music in front of you, maybe they can share screen to show their piece that they've written. And then you can discuss all the different aspects of it, which would help not only them, but everybody else that's watching that go, oh, I see how to strengthen that composition and make it better. But it's a sharing is a great way to learn. And you can do this just over Zoom calls with each student sharing just a little bit. They need to learn to feel comfortable with it. I mean, if you're going to be a composer, you have to be somewhat thick-skinned because not everybody's going to like everything you write. But in a classroom situation with young students, it's just a fun thing to do. And you want to be able to share. It's your music. It's come out of you. It is your intellectual property, even if you're 10 years old. And it's important that you're able to share that and feel good about it. It's our responsibility as a teacher to take that, nurture it, and respond to it and critique it in a way that is encouraging and not discouraging. So that just falls to us individually. But yes, you can use all of these concepts and ideas and materials with students online in a virtual setting.
Awesome. Well, I don't think we have any other questions for today. So Robert, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, go ahead and fill out that survey and tell us what you want to see from us next time. But until then, have a wonderful week, a wonderful weekend. We'll see you soon.
Thank you very much. Don't be afraid of trying these things. We all have the ability to do it, and so do your students. So good luck.